Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Matt and Cheryl's Gen Excellent Playlist. I'm Matt.
I'm Sheryl.
I don't know what number episode this is, but I feel like it's a landmark show because our little Gen X music exercise, we're well into the 80s now, but a lot of people think really the 80s music starts with the emergence of one particular band. And we're going to talk about that band today. It's Cheryl's album pick for the year 1982. And that album is Duran Duran's Rio. We're going to spend the majority of our time talking about Duran Duran. But my song for this week, America had a comeback hit in 1982. And I'm going to start here because our new strategy of plotting these episodes where Sheryl and I make our lists for the year and then compare our notes before we proceed in that year. This is probably the one song that surprised me the most that it's going to end up being on our
That
show.
we both chose it.
Yeah, the fact that we both love this song caught me by surprise. The song is You Can Do Magic, and it's very much a soft rock song like most of their big hits. Of course, America had a string of great hit singles in the early and mid 70s, starting with A Horse with No Name.
That's the one that most people would know.
Right, but they had other big hits, Sister Golden Hair, which was one of my favorite songs of 1975. That was the number one song. Tin Man, Ventura Highway, that's a classic. I mean, all of these songs are worthy of the playlist, but we had such a small sampling of music from that era that they didn't quite make it. But here, 6 years after their last hit song in 1976, they come out of the blue with this one. And the knock on America, and we've talked about this before, Sheryl, you and I, a bad lyric doesn't necessarily make a bad song. A really transcendent, great song will go beyond whether the lyric just doesn't matter if the song is good enough. And America really qualifies with a lot of their hits because their lyrics are pretty dumb. They do not hold up to close scrutiny a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, they don't really make sense and they're just kind of silly.
So what makes this song interesting is they had nothing to do with anything in this song other than singing the vocals. They didn't write it. They didn't play instruments on it, although they're not known as instrumentalists, mainly as vocalists. And I think only the drummer from their band actually plays on the record. The composition of the music, the lyrics, and the performance of most of the music on the record is all by one guy who also produced the hit song for them. And he's notable because he's had several other hit songs, starting with the group he was in back in the early 1970s, Argent. That was, of course, Hold Your Head Up. It's a song that's considered a one-hit wonder in 1972.
Woman, hold your head up. Woman.
Hold your head high. So Argent was the group. It's Rod Argent, the keyboard player from the Zombies. The guy who wrote the song and the guitarist in the band is a guy by the name of Russ Ballard. And, you know, they had other songs that got FM radio airplay, although Hold Your Head Up was really the only top 40 hit for Argent in the United States. But Russ Ballard wrote a bunch of hit songs for other people. Liar, which Argent performed first, then Three Dog Night had a hit with it.
Mm-hmm. I like that song.
That's a good one. How about I Know There's Something Going On by Frida? You like that one, right?
I love that song. Yes. Produced by Phil Collins.
Yeah.
Featuring him on drums. Yeah.
Since You've Been Gone by Rainbow. They're one top 40 in the United States. New York Groove, the Ace Frehley song. That's a Russ Ballard composition. So he's had a bunch of these.
Also Winning that Santana had a hit with.
Yeah, that was a song I had under consideration for 1981. So he wrote the song. He plays almost all the instruments on the track. He produces the track. And it's basically just the voices of Jerry Beckley and Dewey Bunnell. So America is essentially a three-piece, but Dan Peake, the other guy, had left the band by this point. He had some drug and alcohol issues and actually discovered Jesus and became an early Christian rocker back in the late 70s. So he was out of the band for a few years at this point. So it's just Jerry Beckley and Dewey Bunnell. Beckley is the composer of Sister Golden Hair and the lead vocalist on that. Bunnell is the voice probably most people recognize as the lead voice in America. Horse with No Name, Tin Man, Ventura Highway. That's him singing lead on all of those. So You Can Do Magic. It's Jerry Beckley is the lead vocalist on this. You can hear them both on it. But, you know, it's just a great pop song. It's well written, well performed. I love the middle eight. And if I wanted to, I could never be free. America, their hit songs have great melodies, great harmonies, and that's basically what makes them special.
The epitome of soft rock.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's because they do have great melodies. They're really easy to sing along with. And this song is kind of funny to me that it came out in 1982 because it's one of those songs, too, that just feels very out of place for the times. And it really should have come out probably in like 1978, you know. America was still putting out albums. Like they had one in 81. Or when did Alibi come out? Wasn't that in 81?
I think it was late 1980. I've had that on CD. So a lot of America's later albums are collectible on CD. They're kind of hard to find. I found Alibi in the store, picked it up, and I started listening. I have a feeling that if you go and investigate those albums, the ones that weren't hit laden, and I've never even listened to their hit. I mean, I've never listened to any of their studio albums.
They're a singles band, really.
Right.
I mean, America's Greatest Hits is a pretty popular greatest hits collection.
Yeah.
You know, if anybody has something of theirs, it's probably that.
And what people should know about that collection is a lot of the songs on there are remixes. They're not the original versions. So George Martin became their producer a few albums into their career, and he produced like 4 or 5 albums for them, but he was still on board when they put out that greatest hits. The songs that he did not produce, so the earliest hits on that album, he went and actually remixed them. So they're not the original versions on the very popular greatest hits album. So a lot of people have that greatest hits. I mean, that's, you know, that's up there with like the Eagles' greatest hits. I mean, one of those
Elton John's.
Yeah, just about everybody has in their collection. Most people who would have an America studio album in their collection probably have their first album, which I think was fairly well regarded outside of the hits. But yeah, it's not really an albums band. It's a singles band. But I get the feeling that if you go and listen to their studio albums, you're going to find 1 or 2 hidden gems on those albums.
Well, I listened to Alibi because, you know, I was listening to albums from 1980, but also Steve Lukather plays on it.
Yep.
And a bunch of other session musicians that play on a lot of things that are great. So that led me to that album. And yeah, I think it has some pretty interesting stuff on it. I think it's pretty cool. It didn't have any hits. And so the fact that they did have a hit in 82 with You Can Do Magic was surprising. You know, they really hadn't had a hit in quite some time. And they were pretty out of step with the times. They had an album out in 83 and 84. So their career didn't just completely end at that point. And also, it's a whole lot better than the other song that has to do with magic that came out in 1982 that was a #1 hit, and also from another artist that has a very, very popular greatest hits collection, Steve Miller. Steve Miller Band.
It's funny you brought that up because we're recording this on a Sunday, and part of my weekend routine is listening to the old Casey Kasem American Top 40 shows that they play on the local oldie station here in Portland. So on Saturdays, they play the 70s, and on Sunday mornings, they do old 80s episode. Today was an 82 show, so I was listening closer to that. And this week in 1982, Abracadabra, the song to which you're referring, the terrible song to which you're referring.
One of the worst #1s ever. Yeah.
It was #2 this week in 1982. So #3 was Eye of the Tiger by Survivor. A song that's just missing out for us. But yeah, it's a much better song than Abracadabra for sure. You know, it's the essence of soft rock. It's pleasant melody, tightly constructed. You got good vocals, good harmonies like you get on everything that America puts out. And the lyrics don't make you cringe. It's a pop song. It's not anything too deep, but it's well written. You know, it's clever. The one thing in the lyric that doesn't work for me, you're the one who can put out the fire.
Wouldn't you want to be starting the fire?
Right,
like,
exactly. That's
why do you want to put out the fire?
I know. That doesn't make any sense to me.
No.
But again, it's a good enough melody. It's well sung. It transcends that little lyrical hiccup for me. And they actually had a follow-up hit to this called The Border, which is a little more rockin' song. That's not a bad song either. I think that hit in 1983. And then that would be the last of America troubling the charts. But they're still touring to this day. They're still out there working.
And is it actually them? I mean, is it actually the...
Yeah, Jerry and Dewey. Yeah.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that it's actually them, because I have been somewhat appalled and annoyed lately by how many bands are touring as a band that no one was in the original incarnation of the band, or even like the second or third incarnation.
It seems like every week this summer, there's been a big show with a nostalgia act around here.
But they should be called tribute bands. They should not be called the band. For example, Little River Band is touring. Not one member is an original member. The most original member was from 1998, someone who joined in 1998. And the same with
Come
Jefferson
on.
Starship. They're doing the same thing. So they should be called tribute bands. They should not
Yeah.
be called Jefferson Starship, Little River Band. So I am glad to hear that America is actually the two singers that you recognize and the core of the band when they're continuing to tour now.
I don't know how you get away with that.
I don't either. Like, that is a tribute band. That is not the band.
Is it the management that somehow acquired the rights to the name and they could just plug anybody in there they want?
It must be. I mean, there's a legal way they can do it. And they're transparent to a point, but you have to search for it. You have to go and look at the band website and see who is actually in the band right now. And it'll tell you, and when, they joined the band. But I think up front, it would probably be more fair to say tribute band. So that's just my little rant.
We talked last episode, I went to see the Electric Light Orchestra show. And of course, Jeff Lynne is the only member of Electric Light Orchestra in the current touring incarnation, but it doesn't matter because...
Well, he's also the only band member that anybody really knows or equates with the band. And he's the lead singer, too.
Yeah. So that's fine. Although I will say that with Richard Tandy, the longtime keyboardist in ELO, passing recently, it would have been nice to have at least a mention of him or some sort of tribute to him in the act they're putting on. But that's just not part of the deal. They're just playing the hits and heading on to the next city. It was a great show, but I think that would have been nice to at least pay tribute because he was alongside Jeff almost the whole ride.
Well, I think a lot of people are not familiar with just like individual band members, which is really one of the reasons why the album I'm picking was so popular, because Duran Duran is a band, but each individual member, people knew and could differentiate between each member, which that's not something that happens often.
No, and each band member made a key contribution to their sound, and it was a democratic congregation where they all shared equally in the songwriting and in the publishing revenue. So Duran Duran, we're placing them in 1982 because that's when the Rio album was released, although really they didn't get their head of steam until 83 in the United States, but they were well on their way to massive worldwide popularity by the end of 1982. It just took a little longer for things to click in the United States, but Rio was actually their second album released in this country. Their first one went somewhat unnoticed. It would be reissued after they got popular in 1983. But part of the funny thing with Duran Duran, particularly as pertains to the United States, there's a lot of tweaking of their product before they finally clicked here. And it really took a remix of a lot of their songs onto a specialized EP to really grab the attention of radio programmers in the United States. They'd already started getting popular on MTV in this country, but radio didn't really pick up the baton until they kind of toughened up their sound with these remixes. But it's kind of head spinning to keep track of all the product.
My gosh. Yes.
Rio is the big breakthrough album with the two massive hit singles for them, Hungry Like the Wolf and the title track.
Yeah, I think Rio is definitive Duran Duran. Everything about it, the whole package with the cover, the songs, the videos on MTV, and the personalities of the band. And really, Duran Duran, this is something that was starting to happen. We've already talked about a couple bands where this is the case, where they were pretty much born out of the club scene. Other bands like Soft Cell, Dexy's Midnight Runners, the Human League, we're in that same position.
All from the industrial north.
Yeah, but actually where it was happening even bigger and on a grander scale was in London, which started like in 1979. And there's this whole group of people that became known as the Blitz Kids. because they were young people, teenagers, really. I mean, most of them were like 18, 19 years old that were congregating at a club called the Blitz. They were brought together mostly by their love of music and fashion. And the god of this movement would be David Bowie. Roxy Music is huge in this too, T-Rex, glam rock in general. But David Bowie's performance on the Top of the Pops in 1973 doing Starman with Mick Ronson on guitar next to him. You know, one of the first times you've ever seen a guy on television put his arm around another guy while they're playing. Look out into the audience. There's a part in that video where he like points out and he says like, I picked on you. And you know, you watch these documentaries about the Blitz Kids with Steve Strange and Rusty Egan and Boy George, and they talk about how that was just like a turning point moment in their lives, and they felt like he was talking to them.
The impact of that moment on British television for music is somewhat akin to the impact the Beatles had on the Ed Sullivan Show in the United States. It created this incredible momentum and influenced so many young people to become musicians.
Yeah. And a big part of that, too, with Bowie was fashion. You know, punk had already happened. Punk was a rejection of the older generation and moving forward into something that belonged to the young people, just like rock and roll was originally. And that was burning everything down to the ground, you know, and just being as shocking as possible. So that had already kind of run its course. At the same time, you know, you still had disco happening. It was huge in Europe and had its massive heyday in America. Then was also burned down to the ground in America by the Disco Sucks movement. Well, it never really had that kind of an impact in Europe.
There wasn't this same stigma placed on the music as it was in the United States. Disco music was considered not masculine in the United States. There just wasn't that same stigma in the UK.
Well, and I think there's always kind of been this thing in the UK where gender fluidity is a lot more prevalent. And I'm not saying that there isn't discrimination, but it's more like, look at Monty Python. Men dressing up like women.
Yeah.
This is something that seems like it's more embedded in their entertainment and more accepted.
Again, drag, not the same stigma in the UK. It's more likely to be found in mainstream entertainment over the years than it is in the United States.
But you kind of had these little separate movements that were happening. You know, you had punk, you had the British heavy metal, and now you had this thing coming from the clubs that was really geared toward glamour, fashion, being outrageous, just like the punks were, but in a different way where it was, you know, like the glamour of Hollywood.
Punk is influencing not the musical style necessarily, but the do-it-yourself aspect of punk is really what's influencing this movement.
Yes.
Rather than the musical styles.
And the do-it-yourself aspect with music, but also with fashion, because these kids were, you know, going out to secondhand stores and finding all these old clothes and like repurposing in them and making their own clothing and really coming up with these just incredible styles that they were creating themselves. So it had a very artistic side to it. And music actually was kind of secondary, but also it wasn't really geared toward live music initially. It was more DJs playing in the clubs, just like disco was too, and hip hop. The DJs played a really big role in this. And same with like how we talked about Dexys Midnight Runners and the Northern Soul movement too. You had DJs coming in and playing these older songs with the Blitz Kids. It was stuff like Kraftwerk, Roxy Music, definitely David Bowie, Sparks. You know, you had the disco things coming in, Chic, Giorgio Moroder. So you had this combination of like R&B and soul and disco and glam rock. Out of the Blitz Kids movement, you got bands like Spandau Ballet was the first one really that recorded a single in 1980 that actually was a number 5 hit in the UK.
And Visage.
Visage would be the next one. And Visage, Steve Strange, who's the frontman for Visage, he and Rusty Egan, who was the drummer for the Rich Kids, which was the band that Glenn Matlock, who was the original bass player of the Sex Pistols, formed. They were the two that actually started this Bowie night. Well, originally it was at a club called Billy's, and then they moved it to the Blitz because it was bigger. So it was this Bowie night that brought all these people out. And Steve Strange is infamous for You hear about Studio 64 and people getting turned away at the door. That's what Steve Strange's role was at the Blitz. You had to look a certain way and play a certain role to be allowed to come into this club. So he was the monitor there. And between the two, and Rusty Egan was the DJ, they started this movement. And Spandau Ballet, if you watch the video, like for their first song, and you watch Duran Duran's early videos, you see how the fashion very much is coming from the same place. They look like kind of like pirates, but not in the way Adam Ant had all the face paint and stuff, but more like the poofy shirts, frilly poofy shirts and sashes, almost like Arabian Night, and also like kind of a military look, with jackets with big shoulder pads and stuff like that. Boy George came from that scene. Ultravox, Midge, who's the lead singer of Ultravox, also was in Visage.
Also was in the Rich Kids, right?
That's right, he was, yeah.
And Thin Lizzy.
Yes, and later on he was in Thin Lizzy.
He's going to tie into a bunch of things we're talking about.
He is, and he also was the writer of Do They Know It's Christmas with Bob Geldof.
That's right.
Which is kind of the end of this. That's sort of like the cutoff point of this whole movement. So anyway, this is happening in London. Now, Duran Duran are from Birmingham, which is the Midlands.
So it's about 150 miles north, I think, of London.
The club that they hung out at and where they rehearsed too was called the Rum Runner. And initially it was Nick Rhodes and John Taylor. They had been friends since they were preteens. And it's funny because you look at old pictures of John Taylor and he was kind of geeky looking. He had glasses. He was very tall. He's tall and thin, and he certainly didn't look like he was going to be a rock star in any way. But Nick Rhodes was definitely a driving force as far as fashion, the art sense. He and John initially became friends because they both were huge music fans and they were both into the same bands. They loved Blondie and David Bowie, Roxy Music, Cockney Rebel, Sparks. They were avid record collectors. And so they started hanging out. They actually didn't start playing guitar. Both of them started on guitar until they were like 16, which is kind of seems a little bit old to me compared to some of these musicians. But they were also very influenced by the DIY of bands that were playing at clubs in Birmingham. And in a short time started to realize that they could actually play those three chords. They can actually probably do this themselves. They talk about how the two of them really had a vision from early on. They were plotting this intent to become this huge band that would incorporate art, fashion, music. And so they kind of set out on this mission. Now, Duran Duran is named after a character in the movie Barbarella, which stars Jane Fonda from the 60s. It's like a cheesy, almost soft porn science fiction movie.
Sci-fi sex romp.
Yes.
I've never seen it. Have you ever seen it?
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah. It's not as bad. It's not as bad as the Girls on Film video. So it's not, I wouldn't call it soft porn, but it's definitely a sexy romp. Yes. Dr. Durand, it actually has a D on the end. That's where they got their name. And Barbarella's was the name of the club in Birmingham that they hung out at the time too. They had a different lead singer, Stephen Tintin Duffy. I don't know if you remember his hit Kiss Me. I do remember that song from like 1985.
No, but I have a Lilac Time CD buried in my collection.
Yes, he went on to form the band The Lilac Time, which actually are really cool. They have some really cool albums, and his solo stuff is good too. So he was initially the vocalist, and they had gone through quite a lot of lineup changes in the interim before they settled on the actual band that would become who we know as Duran Duran. I think Stephen Duffy was in the band for about a year, and then he left thinking that they really didn't have much potential.
Yeah, kind of left him on short notice too. It was really without any indication.
Yeah, so they brought in another singer named Andy Wickett, and he actually does become pretty important in their story because he's the one that wrote, the chorus basically to Girls on Film. He also wrote a song that would later become kind of the backbone of Rio. So at this point, now they have a new lead singer coming in. They still don't really have the band formed, but Roger Taylor sees them playing at Barbarella's. So he was familiar with the band, and They asked him if he wanted to come and audition, and he did, and they were happy with it. I mean, Roger Taylor is basically like a drum machine.
Yeah, he's just solid. Just
He is
solid.
just solid. And that's how he seems just as a person, too. He's quiet and mild-mannered, just solid guy, handsome.
Unflappable, doesn't usually
Yes.
change his expression much, doesn't get excited.
And that ended up being a good fit for them because John had now at this point switched to bass. He was a really big fan of Chic and he wanted to be a rhythm section. So now they wanted a guitarist. They were looking for somebody who could sort of be like a Mick Ronson, a little bit more in the rock vein. And Andy Taylor's actually from Newcastle. He's the only one that isn't from Birmingham. But he had been in cover bands, and he definitely came from a rock background. One of his favorite bands was AC/DC. So he comes in next, and now the four of them are actually working at this point at the Rum Runner. Simon Le Bon is the last piece of this puzzle. Apparently, he came to the audition wearing pink leopard print trousers and a book of poetry. Simon Le Bon actually did have a background in acting. He was like a choir boy and he had, been singing as a young kid.
And that's his real name, believe it or not.
That's his real name. And so they were kind of like, this guy's going to be a star. Like, we know this guy's going to be a star. His name's Simon Le Bon.
Names turn out to be very important, I think, in the Duran Duran story. They nailed the group name. It's just a cool name.
Yeah.
And then Simon Le Bon is come on. I mean, that's too good to be true.
And then they had the three Taylors. None of them are related. And so that was always kind of interesting too, because, initially it was like, are these guys brothers? Are they, what's the relation here? But there is no relation.
Andy Taylor, Roger Taylor, going by their real names. John Taylor was actually Nigel John Taylor. And then Nick Rhodes changed his name.
He did.
I forget what his actual name is, but
yeah. And actually, before Simon Le Bon joined, they did record 4 demos with Bob Lamb, with Andy Wickett on lead vocals. Of those songs, one of them is Girls on Film, which is not the same version that would eventually become what was on their first album, but it was similar. The chorus is definitely the same. And the other song that was going to be reworked into Rio. And, at this time, they were coming up at the same time as UB40 and Dexy's Midnight Runners, all from Birmingham, and the English Beat as well, also from Birmingham.
I want to say Bob Lamb actually produced that first UB40 album.
He did. Yep. Yeah. So there was a connection there. But they talk about how, in this whole scene, there was no sense of camaraderie around these bands. It was very competitive.
Dexy's Midnight Runners, there wasn't camaraderie with them and other bands. I find that hard to believe.
But then you also had what was happening over in London with the Blitz Kids. And this is not something that Americans would be familiar with or really understand as much, but Spandau Ballet and Duran Duran had this huge rival going in England. And it was like, it was like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones.
This is before anybody knew about either of these bands in the United States.
Well, I'm saying even when everybody did know about those bands in the United States, there was never this sense that there was a big competition between them. But in England, it was very much so. And it got more so as they both became more popular. But, Spandau Ballet was the first band that had a single from this group of people and the first, a hit single in the UK. And we're putting out videos. So you had this going on in Birmingham. You had the Blitz Kids going on in London. But the Birmingham scene, even though there was a lot of competition there, the Duran guys talk about how it still felt not as snobbish, I guess, where at the Blitz, it was kind of what I think of like Studio 54 being like, where, only certain people are allowed in. Even Mick Jagger got turned away from the Blitz. So now Duran Duran is together and they record a couple songs that will become their first singles. Planet Earth actually is a top 10 hit in the UK.
Planet Earth, their first single, was a hit in England, and then they wanted Girls on Film to be the next release, but the record company put the kibosh on that, or I don't know if it was the record company or their management or both, and Careless Memories, although not a total stiff, was not a hit follow-up.
No, I don't even know if it was a top 40.
No, I don't think so.
But they made videos for Planet Earth, which is actually a really cool video. And that video was produced by Russell Mulcahy. who would become very important to them once Rio came out.
Yeah. Not only them, but he became like the preeminent music video director of the time.
Yes. The other thing they did with video is they hired Godley and Cream, who were 10cc. They were in the band 10cc.
Yep.
They took the 12-inch version, which is longer, and they made a video to accompany that they intended to play in clubs. And it was X-rated.
Because back in this era, big nightclubs had video jukeboxes.
Yeah. That actually also was something that drew attention to them. It did end up being heavily edited and shown on MTV eventually, but that was not the initial intent.
But I think by the time people saw the edited version of that video, pretty much everybody had heard about the unedited version. It was something that was talked about quite a bit. And I think it turned out to be a really clever bit of marketing for them. I think it gave them somewhat of an underground foothold in America before they hit the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, hardcore club goers would have been aware of this and seen it. But, the kids who would make up their major demographic later on, this would be pretty heady for them. But they hadn't made a name for themselves in America yet. So they kind of got notorious for this video before they troubled the charts in the United States.
Yeah. So it did end up working in their favor. Maybe the fact that they used Godley and Cream, who had experience with making video and they were more art oriented and
quite innovative videos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the first album comes out. It does well in the UK. And at this time, they go on a theater tour supporting Hazel O'Connor, who is also one of those artists that no one in America knows, but she was very big in England. And she had just done a movie called Breaking Glass. Her career was kind of waning at that point, and Duran Duran really was more popular than she was on that tour. They gained a lot of exposure from that tour. The album still really hadn't made its way to America, though, as far as, like you said, it was issued in America, but it didn't have
low-key release, not a lot of promotion.
Yeah.
Radio didn't pick up on it.
And MTV wasn't, MTV was just starting at this point.
MTV comes online, I think, in August of 1981. And at that point, it's just like small areas in New Jersey and Long Island, I think, were the only people that even had access to it. So it took a while for MTV really to have a significant impact.
Yeah. At this point, they had made a couple videos. And, like we were talking about MTV, videos were already being played a lot in Europe on TV. And so a lot of bands were already making videos before MTV was popular. Duran Duran was already kind of starting to have a presence in video at this point. And I think part of that too is because they were really interested in the whole package of fashion, visual images, including videos.
They were also very ambitious, and they saw this as an emerging trend, as an effective marketing tool, something that would get them exposure worldwide in different markets without the help of radio. And they were savvy enough to jump on that train early on. This is a band that wanted to be famous. They were very organized. They were very business savvy. They kind of mapped out a list of goals and a timeline.
Yeah.
And they went for it.
And really, Nick and John were the ones that planted that seed. The two of them together, they really had a vision and they drove this. And actually, I forgot to mention when they put out the singles, there was a bidding war to sign Duran Duran between EMI and Phonogram. And they chose EMI because of the Beatles connection. So they were signed to EMI, recorded their first album. And actually, I really like the first album a lot.
Yeah, I do too.
In some ways, I like it better than Rio. The singles on that album are great. And it's more of a mix of the disco, pop, funk sound and the more ethereal, artsy, kind of like Roxy Music, Brian Eno type sound that is really driven by Nick Rhodes.
I will say this, though. When this album does get reissued in the United States after Rio, after their popularity breakthrough, the album gets reissued in 1983. So most people missed the boat first time around.
Yeah.
When they reissue the album, they put their new single on there. They released a non-album single after Rio. Is There Something I Should Know, which is probably my favorite Duran Duran
I
single.
know. It's definitely one of my favorites. Yeah.
So they stuck that on the reissued first album. So Is There Something I Should Know comes out as a single in 83, but they reissue the 1981 self-titled album in 83, stick Is There Something I Should Know at the end of side one. And it's jarring to hear it in that context because, like you, I do like this album. But after the first four songs, Girls on Film, Planet Earth, Is There Anyone Out There, Careless Memories, then there's just this jarring sonic. It just doesn't fit sonically with the rest of the songs on that
Yeah.
album. It
It does feel
doesn't
really out
sound
of
as,
place.
yeah, and it doesn't
Hmm.
sound as good, frankly. It's I like the production. I think the or at least the CD version I have, which is an early Japan pressed EMI CD, probably from 83 or so, 84 maybe. It sounds really good. It sounds smooth, but
Hmm.
then boom, here comes Is There Something I Should Know? And it's really kind of tinny and
Tinny.
bright. And yeah, it's a great song.
Yeah.
It's maybe their best song, but sound quality wise, it's a jarring experience to hear that just plopped into the middle of that album.
I think especially where they put it in the album, because
Yeah.
they put it at the end of side one, which is all like the more, pop oriented songs. And then you go into side two, Waiting for the Night Boat's the first song on side two, which is very moody and dark and kind of eerie. And it's just like, it sounds nothing like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the other songs, I mean, Friends of Mine is more poppy, but the other two are also in that vein of more moody pieces. And so, yeah, it really does break it up in a weird way.
And they lopped a song off the album to squeeze
Mm-hmm.
Is There Something I Should Know? A song called To the Shore, which I haven't heard. So collecting Duran Duran is a bit of a challenge because there's a lot of this tweaking going on with a lot. So like different versions, different mixes.
So many different mixes.
Yeah.
Every single, they did a night mix, they called it, which is usually
Yeah.
an extended mix. And Nick Rhodes is really who was driving that. In some ways it was cool because a lot of these versions are very different.
Interesting aspect of this is, so this is pre-digital editing and Pro Tools and all these production tools. So, most of the time when you're hearing a remix of a track, it's just studio tweaking. It's taking the multi-track tapes and emphasizing something that might have been de-emphasized,
Yeah.
making this louder, adding this element that we left off, whatever, looping something, making it long. They actually performed completely new versions of these songs in the studio. This wasn't tweaking of tapes. These were practically new recordings for these night versions.
Which I think is really cool. And for fans, I think was really exciting. And I mean, I remember they always had like a different version or even sometimes unreleased songs on them. I mean, I think the other band that did this really well was New Order, where it was like the singles, the 12-inch singles were really important in their catalogs because they would add so many things on there that were not on the albums.
And for dance music, if you're an audiophile, these are the best sounding versions. You can have wider grooves.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 12-inch LP, but it's playing at 45 revolutions per minute. You get a lot more information into the grooves of the record and a lot bigger sound for a band like Duran Duran that's built around that rhythm section, that funky rhythm section. This is the best way to experience these songs.
And built for clubs, built to be played in clubs. So they go into the studio to record their second album. They actually put out a single, My Own Way, which, once again, a completely different version than what's on the album. It's much faster and it's pure disco. I don't really think that single did very well in the charts, but then Rio comes out in 1982. Now, for me, I was a huge Duran Duran fan, but like most teens in America, I really didn't become a big fan until 1983 into 1984. That was when that second British invasion was really in full force, and MTV was the way that I was discovering new music, and Smash Hits, which you mentioned on the last episode, a teen-driven music magazine where you have all those pinups, basically, pictures of them that you cut them out and stick on your bedroom wall if you were a kid in that era.
The rock press of the day didn't care for Duran Duran much, wrote them off, the New Musical Express and Melody Maker, Rolling Stone in the United States, whatnot. But Smash Hits was more directed toward a pop audience than a rock audience. And they fully embraced Duran Duran. Duran Duran was the poster band for this magazine.
Yeah. So once you get into 1982, This is where they start building that image that most people are really the most familiar with as far as the band goes. And that image was also built by their videos. The 3 singles are Rio, Hungry Like the Wolf, and Save a Prayer. And they once again hired Russell Mulcahy to direct these videos. He had the foresight to bring them to these exotic locations to film. So Rio was filmed in Antigua, and Save a Prayer and Hungry Like the Wolf were filmed in Sri Lanka. You know, they're in this exotic location. They're beautiful people.
You don't think that had something to do with their success now, do you?
Especially Rio, though, really. Like, I think that Rio, the song and the video, just the whole package, I mean, that is the definitive Duran Duran.
They are forever tied to yachts, to their eternal dismay. They are forever linked with yachts.
Well, Simon Le Bon actually is
Although
a yachtsman.
Simon's a yachter.
Yeah, he is.
Yes, that's right.
But, you know, for the band, it is kind of funny because the way they're portrayed in that video, they seem like they are like the rich, you know, lifestyles of the rich and famous, basically.
Right.
Which is really not where they were at that time. Those were probably like the only suits they owned, and they were getting ruined by seawater in the video.
They weren't all poor working class boys. I mean, Nick Rhodes was fairly posh, middle class kid. I think Roger Taylor had a fairly comfortable family.
Yes, but
not,
they certainly
not rich,
weren't
not
living
rich.
the life
Yeah.
that looks like they would be in that video.
No, they all came from solid families.
Yeah.
A couple of them more affluent. You know, I think Nick probably the most of the group.
And he comes across like he is too, really.
Right. Well, he's got this very posh manner to him. That's his persona.
Yes.
I think really Andy and John are probably the most working class of the group.
And, you know, the video for Rio, you know, of course, they have the beautiful women and just all the imagery behind it kind of put them into a different class. And then Save a Prayer, I think, is one of those where you see their personalities a lot in the video, and it looks like they're kind of romping around and having fun. And it's theatrical, but it also kind of gives you a glimpse of sort of their personalities too. And then Hungry Like the Wolf is basically just like a ripoff of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it's definitely like a little mini movie in that way.
And that video got absolutely played to death on every show that, you know, Friday Night Videos, MTV.
Yeah.
That video got played ad nauseum.
Oh, yeah. But at the time, it was one of the best videos that was out there. You know, I mean, it was definitely a higher quality than almost anything you would see on MTV at that point, and it stood out. So for me, okay, Rio is my album of 1982, and I feel like I have to put the record itself in one category in my mind, and then I put Duran Duran in just a separate category of its own. Like I said, the album I was not familiar with in 1982. It took me a few years to get there, just like a lot of kids my age in America. And a lot of it was driven by MTV. And now I can go back and listen to it kind of with different ears too. And I still think it's a great album. I think it is completely worthy of all the attention. And I think it's totally worthy that they became superstars because of this album. So much of it is driven by the rhythm section. You've got John Taylor playing out of his league. I mean, pretty much it sounds like he's playing every note he knows.
So I've read a couple of Duran Duran, but I got through all the way through John's autobiography in the Pleasure Groove. And then there's another Duran book, Please, Please Tell Me Now, written by the same author that did the Led Zeppelin Hammer of the Gods book. Kind of incongruous. Please, Please Tell Me Now, the Duran Duran story. This book is such a fun read because these guys are all wonderful storytellers. They're all super charming. Yes. But you're right about John Taylor, and he's kind of nonchalant about, well, yeah, he liked Chic, and he switched to bass. I just found it a natural affinity for playing Bernard Edwards bass. It's like, Bernard Edwards is a beast on the. I mean, this guy was one of the most respected bass players in the business. And he's like, yeah, I just picked up the bass and found I could naturally just play his parts. I'm like, are you serious? Really? I mean, he's pretty talented musician.
He'd only been playing for like 3 years when they recorded Rio. Over the years, there's been all kinds of rumors swirling around that Bernard Edwards actually played bass on Rio.
Well,
which I haven't been able to find any evidence that that is actually true.
I highly doubt it. I mean, once they became affiliated with Nile Rodgers, that's a good
And
conspiracy
that would have
theory
been
at
on
that
Seven and the
point.
Ragged Tiger at that point, yeah.
Right.
But
Yeah.
not for Rio.
No.
And you can
That's
watch live
ridiculous.
performances of them. There's actually a professional video of Live at the Palladium in 1982, and John's playing every note. That's from 1982.
Yeah. These guys could play. I mean, they're not virtuosos, but John Taylor's a really good bass player. Andy Taylor is a good guitar player. Roger Taylor is a good drummer.
And Nick Rhodes adds some pretty interesting flourishes. Simon Le Bon is probably the one that is the most questionable of all of them.
He's the weak link of the five, but just sheer force of personality and charisma, he wins you over.
And, his voice, it works. He doesn't have much range is the problem. I like it when he sings in the lower register, and I think it sounds good and it works in that way. But if you hear him sing live, you can really sense that he struggles.
And if you read the biographies, he got put through the ringer on that first album because he struggled in the studio, and they're like, we got a problem here. This guy can't sing. We might have to think about getting a different vocalist. And he, to his credit, he eventually stepped up and got it done. But I think you file him in the David Lee Roth category of vocalists who just, great front man, not a great vocalist.
Although you can tell that he has an acting background because in the videos, he's great.
Oh, he's a natural. Yeah.
But he's a terrible dancer. He is like the worst dancer.
He's a big dude.
He is. He and John are both quite tall, but Simon is like stocky too. Yeah.
I guess he was a rugby player, so he's put together.
Yeah.
And then, John was not athletic, but he's tall and insanely good looking.
Yes, he has that chiseled jawline and yeah.
The whole thing about him being this nerd in glasses and then one day he just takes them off. I'm like, oh no, you're the most beautiful man in rock. We just didn't realize because you had your glasses on.
Crazy. And you needed a better haircut. But Simon, I think he sort of moved away from the dancing, which he was trying to do in the early days, and sort of kind of bring in more of his acting skills, I think, just to interact with the audience. As far as the album itself goes, most of it is full on disco, like it is disco rhythms. But one of the things that sets them apart is that you have the rock guitar of Andy Taylor. So interspersed in that, you get the tough guitar stabs here and there and guitar solos.
But he can also play the funk licks. He can play the Nile Rodgers style, scratch. His versatility is very critical to the group.
But really, I mean, John plays like a lead bass. It's really apparent in Rio.
Oh, that's chic. I mean, the bass is the lead instrument. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think Rio is one of the best opening tracks of an album ever. Because it starts out with that kind of like, it sort of like builds up into this, and then it just comes right in, and it's like full force. It's just so exciting. It's just like pure excitement.
And this is, Nick Rhodes not being a virtuoso musician or anything. So the sequencer, this is really an early album where synth sequences are a big part of the sound.
Yes.
Particularly on Rio.
Yeah.
Where you've got the repeating pattern on the synth. And if you watch live, they were a good live act, but I mean, he's not playing all these parts on he's triggering these synth sequences, but it's just a critical element, particularly on Rio, that really makes it stand out.
And I think sequencing is interesting because whoever is creating those sounds, he had to build that. He had to put together that collection of notes or whatever to make that sequence.
Yeah.
And
it's sound painting.
Yeah.
Sound painting.
And even though it's repeated constantly, it's still something that has to be created in a way that takes artistic flair and skill.
Well, then you go to Save a Prayer, and there's the beautiful synth washes on that song. I mean, that's maybe his shining moment, I think. You nailed it on the head with Duran Duran. Each of the five guys, what they bring to the table all weaves together beautifully, and they're all a critical element to the sound as a whole.
Yes. Which is why they wouldn't have worked with Stephen Tintin Duffy on vocals, or if they didn't get Andy Taylor in on guitar, or if they had a drummer that wasn't just a solid, basically drum machine, who was gorgeous.
Roger Taylor, kind of the underrated heartthrob in the group, you think? I mean, Nick, Simon, and John are all ridiculously good-looking guys.
Yes.
I mean, Simon is this robust, very masculine rugby player. John's just this beautiful, statuesque guy. Still looks amazing. And then Nick is kind of the androgyne.
Nick is beautiful.
Very soft features and kind of posh, suave manner. I mean, it cracked me up that John, even in the immediate time period after disposing of the glasses and becoming this rock, took a while for him to really start being this big ladies man, because he and Simon are like, and people just assume they were gay.
Oh, yeah.
Which I found amusing. But these guys are all very heterosexual. I mean, if there was one guy you thought might swing both ways, it would have to be Nick, right?
But they so embraced, especially Nick, makeup particularly, but the big hair, the very, and it was very feminine, but it was done in a way that was very sexy, and it was still really appealing to women. They certainly were one of the first bands to like really bring in beauty for men, and have that glamorous look about them that was still sexy. Anyway, the album, like I said, that's in a separate category for me. The thing that's great that I love about this album, I think all the singles are great, but the album tracks are just as good or even better at times. Like My Own Way, the version that's on the album, I love. They slowed it down. It's not as disco-y. It has way more guitar on it. It's a lot more rockin' than the single version. Lonely in Your Nightmare is beautiful. And John plays fretless bass on this song. He's very influenced by Mick Karn from Japan. I don't think we can talk about Duran Duran without mentioning Japan. I think their first album came out in 1976. They started out kind of more like a punk band, really, but morphed into a much more artsy, way more Roxy music influence, and not quite as much chic influence like Duran Duran is, but definitely had the Bowie Roxy music, much more artsy. Their album Quiet Life, which came out in 79, I mean, the sequencing and stuff in that album sounds exactly like Planet Earth. And, it's very similar to Rio. And even down to David Sylvian's voice sounds just like Simon's. I mean, it's very similar.
And his haircut, maybe, too.
His haircut looks just like Nick's. Yeah.
Yep. And John's sporting that same hair, too.
Whether or not they want to admit that they were really influenced by Japan. Now, I have heard John say that he was influenced by Mick Karn, who's the bass player who played fretless bass for Japan. Nick has really not mentioned Japan, but I feel, though, it's impossible to think he was not influenced by them.
I clearly remember reading my sister's Smash Hits magazines, and Japan and Roxy Music were the two groups that I remember being cited as most influential on Duran Duran.
Well, and I think it's interesting because if you listen to Japan, especially their album Tin Drum that came out in 1981, you hear a lot of the similarities, and Quiet Life, but they were not ever going to be as popular as Duran Duran. No one was ever going to be as popular as Duran Duran.
Too artsy, not poppy enough.
Well, yes. And all of the planets aligned in a way that allowed Duran Duran to be what they were. Let me finish the album, though. So going through the album, Hungry Like the Wolf, of course, great song. Rockin' also has that weird bubbly synth going on through the whole song. Hold Back the Rain is probably the most guitar-oriented song and the least disco-y sounding. New Religion is kind of what they brought back from the first album, of that more moody, almost sounds like Pink Floyd at the beginning, actually. But it's cool. I really like it. I think, that and Lonely in Your Nightmare are both kind of like that. And this is one where I think Simon's vocals and lyrics are a little more interesting. Simon came in with that book of poetry or whatever. And to be honest, most of Duran Duran's lyrics, a lot of them are just like pretty bad and cheesy and don't really mean anything. And then you get songs like New Religion, where he's like spouting off all these words, and he's like, basically it seems like he's reading a poem.
Jim Morrison was a big influence, which I was unaware of as well. He definitely cited the Doors and Jim Morrison in particular, the poetic lyrics.
Yeah, I could see that.
Really what he was going for.
I could see that, because like Waiting for the Night Boat, or like The Chauffeur is a really good example of that, which is basically a poem. And it's not bad. I can see where he had some talent there. But then the songs that don't really have much of a storyline to them, the lyrics are just very throwaway and don't make sense.
They really get exposed on the next album. many other reasons why that album fails. But I kind of think of his lyrics, I kind of lump it in with Blondie, where sometimes it works really well, sometimes it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't. Sometimes it just sounds dumb. Sometimes, oh, that's clever.
I think that the way he's best on choruses, he can put together couplets that are really cool and sound good and have
Yeah.
and just work with the song. But when it comes to the verses, yeah, it doesn't always work. But that's okay because the music stands up enough that you don't really need
Yes.
it.
Yes, it does. Yes.
So then a Last Chance on the Stairway has always been like a song I never liked, even when I was young. I don't know why. Save a Prayer, of course, is iconic, and that's the song that makes
Beautiful
you fall
song.
in love
Yeah.
with Simon Le Bon,
Were you imagining mornings after with Simon Le Bon as a youngster? Is that what you're talking about, Sheryl?
I was always a Simon girl. He was my man. And The Chauffeur, definitely the artsiest song on the album. That's where that Sing Blue Silver.
Wasn't that their video was called Sing Blue Silver? Wasn't it?
That's
Yeah.
what their video, the tour in 83, 84, they was deemed Sing Blue Silver. So that's where that came from.
Did you go to the show?
I did not. I wanted to. I was in 9th grade and I did not go. I did see the Power Station and OMD a year later.
With Michael DeBar.
Yeah. So going back, listening to the album, I still think it's great. I love the combination of all the different styles they're bringing in. They're not doing anything groundbreaking, I mean, they wear their influences on their sleeves, but that's okay because I think when you bring it all together, it is something that is unique enough and, it really defines a moment in time and it still holds up.
You got to appreciate the fact that this is a band formed by two guys super into music, John Taylor and Nick Rhodes. They bought tons of records. They went to every big show that came through Birmingham. They were very knowledgeable about music. They're smart guys. I mean, you get the sense from seeing the docs, reading the books, that they were all raised well, came from good families. They all have a good head on their shoulders. John succumbed to some addictions and is a recovering addict, but I don't think he ever got really
John
bad.
and Andy were pretty big coke fiends, but they were the two, especially during the Power Station days, where they were just, pretty out of control.
That album sounds like coke personified. That's the absolute nadir of 80s production for me.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. I think that they still were grounded enough, which is pretty amazing considering where they were at in the public eye.
Yeah. They were smart and savvy enough. They had the business sense, although they did sign a management deal where their managers got pretty damn rich off their backs. But these guys also worked their tails off to get them successful. So I think they give them credit for that. And they're all just charming as hell. I mean, they're great raconteurs, great storytellers. Yeah. They seem like pleasant people to be around. They're all very likable. There's obviously egos there because they care so much about the way they look and everything, but they're self-effacing enough to laugh at themselves and goof around. And it just seemed like a band of brothers.
Yes.
I mean, whenever they appeared together, the chemistry was very apparent. It wasn't forced at all. So they had all that going for them. When we talked about XTC, I said that's as close as we've gotten to Beatles since the Beatles. But to be perfectly frank, nobody has gotten anywhere near the Beatles. But if you're picking something that got close, XTC musically, because of the innovation and the melodic sense, Duran Duran for just the charm factor, the cultural aspect, the screaming girls, chasing them around the streets and pounding on the cars and filling up the arenas.
Yeah.
That is as close as we've come to Beatlemania since the Beatles. But honestly, nothing comes anywhere near as close to the Beatles because they had a sustained excellence over the entirety of their career. And Duran Duran's was a very short period of time where artistically they kind of took a nosedive.
If you take 1983 and 1984, when they came to America, they did a press conference just like the Beatles. And that is the moment right there where you see that it is the closest thing that's ever come to the Beatles. They're witty, they're charming, they charm the press just like the Beatles did. And they already have the screaming girls and the fans. So I think the fan response and the way that they present themselves to the media and to the world is the connection between them and the Beatles. but it's a very small snapshot in time of about a year.
Yeah.
And it's funny because when you watch that press conference, the press are constantly asking them about the Beatles. How do you see yourselves being compared to the Beatles? What do you think this, and they're constantly deflecting those questions and saying, we don't like to think about the past. We're the future. We're the present. We don't, because they know they're not the Beatles, like they have one album, two albums that are huge. Well, actually, at that point, they did have Seven and the Ragged Tiger had come out. The Reflex was a number one hit. So, they were at the height of their career, but there is no comparison aside from the crowd response and what we see from the way they carry themselves, the way they are so likable. So, that
Yeah.
is the connection between them and the Beatles. And also the saturation. There was no other band that
Yeah.
you saw
Yeah.
in every single
The
magazine,
merchandising.
every merchandise, everything. I mean, the Beatles were at that point too, where, you could buy anything that had their image on it. Even back in 1964, when that kind of stuff wasn't even that, people weren't making merch. Well, the Beatles had everything was Beatle merch. Duran Duran were at
Yeah.
that height too, and there's not a lot of bands that are that saturated, in the market that way.
So my Duran Duran experience is a little different because I think I was on board with them before many people in the United States, just via my dad's work at a radio station. And I don't know if I heard them on the radio first or picked them up on a radio show record that my dad brought home. But I remember really liking Hungry Like the Wolf and Rio, the singles that came out in '82, and taping them off this radio show record onto a mixtape with other songs from that era. And this is before ever knowing what they looked like or anything
Yeah.
about them, just hearing the songs. The songs were that good, I thought. And I'm not a rock kid. I didn't listen to rock radio at this point. I was top 40, and I loved disco in the 70s. And, I'm not aware of this whole disco backlash or any of that stuff. I just know what's being played on the radio, and you're not hearing the same kind of songs that you used to. They're taking all these different elements. They're getting a dance-oriented rhythm section, a disco beat if you want. The post-punk element really showing up in the guitar work, I think, of Andy Taylor, just the effects on the guitar, not the heavy, fat distortion, but more the chorusing type effects and the sound painting, but also playing the funky style when warranted. And then Nick with his synthesizer coloration. The melodies were good. The songs were catchy. They were clever. They sounded very modern. They sounded very today. So I was pretty hip to Duran Duran early on. And then it was after they had this huge breakthrough with MTV and all this exposure. And then it got to this oversaturation point where you had Rio was the hit album of the moment. Then they reissue the first album. And then just right after that, you get their third album coming out, which was somewhat of a rush job and not very good. So,
Somewhat,
by the
but
end
it
of
took
83,
them like a year and a half to put that album out, to recording that album and putting it together. And it was
Yeah.
one of those albums, I
Yeah.
think, too, that suffered from that because it was Nick Rhodes being a perfectionist and like reworking and overworking things and going into the studio with
Yeah.
no material and trying to top something that was already one of the hugest albums of all time. That's tough for anyone.
Right. So I'm kind of into Duran Duran before the teenage girls got there. And then I'm still on board with, Is There Something I Should Know comes out in '83, and that's a killer single. But then the Seven of the Ragged Tiger stuff, I remember Union of the Snake, it's all right. Newman on Monday was all right. The Reflex, I just hated. I just didn't like that
I
at
love
all.
the Reflex, but it has some of the most inane lyrics ever. It's awful, but I still love the song.
There's another case where the song isn't good enough to overcome the lyrical shortcomings, which are vast. It's terrible.
I think it is. The single version. They made a mistake, though. The version that's on the album is not the same as the single version. It doesn't start with that ta-na-na-na-na, ta-na-na-na, the Reflex, which I think is really cool and would have been a great way to build into that album to start. But the album version doesn't start that way. It just goes right into the verse. So I think they missed the boat there.
But I think the combination of the newer singles off Seven and the Ragged Tiger just not holding up to the Rio singles, and just all of a sudden they're like the girls band. Girls are just so in love with this. and it just kind of turned me off of them. So by the end of '83, I'm pretty much over Duran Duran. And then they continued to be very popular for a couple of years.
You had the kind of the opposite effect then, because you went from liking them for their music, and then because the music wasn't holding up, once Seven and the Ragged Tiger, then you started,
Yeah,
where me, that's when I was amping up more, because that's when I was like seeing them more in, the
right.
videos and watching the Sing Blue Silver documentary of the tour that I watched probably a million times. My friend Shannon and I were just obsessed with it. And her dad had 2 VCRs so we could tape a tape, so we rented them from the video store and taped them, so we had them, we just watched it
Oh,
constantly. And it was so great
nice.
because you could see them behind the scenes and just being themselves. And they were so genuinely just charming people. They weren't fake,
Yeah.
and they come across, even though they ended up hating each other, not all of them, but they come across, like you said, as a band of brothers, like the Beatles did. That's the other similarity there, where they were sort of in this thing together. The only people that were experiencing this thing was them together. And so they banded together in that way. And they come across that way in the tour video, where you see them goofing around with each other and just being themselves. And I think that elevated them, even though they seem untouchable in that Rio sense, that like, or even just like the Nagel cover, the artwork for the cover, like it
Yeah.
just feels so glamorous and like lifestyles of the rich
Very
and
much.
famous,
Yeah.
and out of
Yeah.
touch. But then you have that other side to them where they seem so genuine and real. So I think the combination of that made it something unique.
That artwork was significant too. Kind of got an Asian feel to
Mhm.
it. And if you didn't see actual Duran Duran posters, you saw artwork in people's bedrooms,
Yeah.
apartments that were very much of that
Inspired
style
by that. Yeah.
showing up in that era.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they were very much of the zeitgeist of that era. But it wasn't a case of feeling like this was my little band and now they're huge. It was more of a musical parting of the ways, I think. It was overexposure, the fact that it was just such a girl band
Yeah.
thing. And then just the songs just weren't up to
Well,
snuff
in
for
Seven
me.
and the Ragged Tiger, I think the singles are good, but the album tracks are crap. And that's one of the things that makes Rio such a great album, is all the tracks are good.
Yeah. Got to give credit to the producer, Colin Thurston. I think they broke off with him, and I thought that was a huge mistake. Those first 2 albums, they sound good. They're
Yeah.
good sounding recordings. Colin Thurston had worked with Bowie and Iggy Pop and Magazine.
Mhm.
I thought that was a great relationship, but I think there was a management dispute
Mhm.
between he and the Duran managers, and they wanted to push him out, which I thought was the beginning of the end.
And Seven of the Ragged Tiger is the beginning of when you get that 80s sound that is very dated,
Ah,
tinny, and
ah.
just painful at times, They also really changed their image. And this is one of the things I think that was so appealing about Rio, is it has that sunny, and that's also a lot of it has to do with the videos, that sunny on the beach glamour, taking you away from all the troubles of the world. Whereas Seven of the Ragged Tigers, the imagery is very dark and they look a little bit older, darker colors like leather, and like it just has a totally different vibe in that way.
The psychological aspect of the image that they were presenting. This is why a lot of people say the 80s start here, music wise, because they're coming out of the post punk scene, which for the most part, that kind of music is dark and dreary.
Yeah.
It's reflecting dark times. It was a bad time in England in the
Yes.
late 70s and early
Yes.
80s. It was very bleak and not much better in the United States. I mean, Ronald Reagan had been in office for a while, but our economy was still in the crapper. You had this nuclear dread. I mean, the Cold War was at about its most frigid. You had this nuclear dread that everybody was feeling
Mhm.
in the early 80s. And then here comes Duran Duran, and it's aspirational. It's fashion forward.
Mhm.
It's
Beautiful people.
Yes, beautiful people wearing beautiful clothes, going to beautiful places,
Mhm.
drinking beautiful drinks.
Yeah.
It was aspirational, and that's really kind of what the 80s would turn into. Is everybody chasing that dream. They kind of represented that, and they were kind of on the vanguard of
Yeah,
that.
particularly with Rio. That is the apex of that, I think. And the
Right, yeah.
video and the album. And, once Seven and the Ragged Tiger, they had been on tour for like a year, and then they got to the point where they couldn't even be in the same room with each other, and they broke into two camps. John and Andy went the rock way and did the Power Station with Robert Palmer and Tony Thompson, who was the drummer from Chic. And then Nick and Simon and Roger kind of had his foot in both camps, but he was mainly going toward Nick and Simon because they already had Tony Thompson and the Power Station. So the other camp did Arcadia, which was a very artsy, pretentious, but actually more interesting album. Then Live Aid happened. So they reconvened in 1985 to play Live Aid. But at that time, they were not speaking to each other. There was definitely a wedge driven between the two camps, and they just wanted nothing to do with each other. But, Nick and John had been friends since they were preteens, so they never really lost that connection, even though they weren't making music together at that time. In fact, John is in one of the Arcadia videos. So after those two albums happened, they got back together with what I would consider, I guess, the core members of the band, Nick, John, and Simon, and continued on as Duran Duran. Roger left the music business altogether, and Andy went off and was doing sessions, and then he had a solo album that came out in 1987 called Thunder that's just like a total 80s generic rock album.
Yep. But if you find that CD, snap it up.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
And then Duran Duran continued. They never really had a hit again until Ordinary World, which came out much later.
93, yeah.
They continue to put out albums, and they were still touring over the years, but they did all get back together to tour not too long ago. But it was never going to be the same again.
One of the things I loved about learning the history of the group, we talked about how organized and motivated and the work ethic that they had. They worked hard to be good musicians. They weren't naturally good musicians. I know Andy Taylor had a lot more experience under his belt playing army bases and stuff as a youngster when he joined the group. But all these guys were learning on the fly, and it was the punk aesthetic, the DIY thing.
Yeah.
But they had a plan. They were organized. They worked their tails off. They did all the things that you have to do to get successful.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it is a grind. I mean, it's a lot of stuff, that's not glamorous, but you got to do it to get to that level. And they plugged away, and they realized their dream really on schedule.
Right. Exactly how Nick and John had laid it out, when they were teenagers.
Simon Le Bon was the last piece of the puzzle, and they finally got that front man in there, and that's probably the most difficult piece to fill.
Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of people out there who could play instruments, and you just practice and you can get good at it. But to be a natural front man, that's got to be kind of ingrained in you to have that ability to get out in front.
Yeah, because there's also plenty of people that can sing and not even have to sing that well, like Simon.
Yeah.
But if you can sell it, and if you can be the leader in that regard and come across in a way that is appealing to the audience, but also doesn't alienate the audience, there's a fine line there. And I think that not a lot of people can walk that, but Simon Le Bon is one who can.
Yes. So the moral of the story here, I mean, once they got all the pieces into place, it started happening pretty fast for them. It didn't take that long before their career took off like a skyrocket. Have a plan, be organized, have a little sense of the business, be willing to put in the work, the dirty work, not just the glamorous stuff, but be willing to work hard and have a good attitude about it and care about your fans. Treat your fans with respect. And it certainly doesn't hurt to be ridiculously handsome
and charismatic.
that's the one part. That's the one part that kind of, I mean, we can all do those things. I mean, everybody has it in them, I think, to do those things that I listed, but not all of us are born looking like Simon Le Bon or John Taylor.
That's why I think all the planets aligned in a way that allowed Duran Duran to be on the top of their game when they were, because they had all of those things. They had the drive. They had enough talent. They had the music background, like as music fans. They had a vision, but they had the looks. They had the charisma. They had MTV that they could just be basically like the poster children for, right at the perfect moment for them.
The timing was impeccable.
They had the director who was directing these videos and sending them out to exotic locations and really working off their charisma and using it in the right way. All of those things happened in this one moment of time that put them where they were. Now, I will say it was very important, though, that they did have an album that could actually hold itself as a musical statement, too, because they could have had a lot of those things going for them. And if the music wasn't there to anchor that, then it probably wouldn't have taken them as far as it did. When I was a teenager, all of my walls were covered with posters, and there were two bands, the Beatles and Duran Duran. That was it.
I like that you chose that as your album of the year. I don't think either of us would say it's the greatest album of that year, but its significance is important. And obviously, it was for you in 1982 and 83. It was the album.
Yes.
So I'm glad we didn't spend too much time on America, because I knew Sheryl was going to spend a lot of time on
I have a lot to say about Duran Duran.
We are flat out of time on this episode, so we'll add a couple more songs to the playlist next time. But until then, I'm Matt.
I'm Sheryl.
And you've been listening to Matt and Sheryl's Gen Excellent Playlist. Thanks for joining us. Take care, everybody.